Hello and welcome to another edition of Ukraine This Week. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee. Now, European leaders met in Copenhagen at the European Political Community Summit, reaffirming support for Ukraine. President Zelensky urged more military aid, tougher sanctions on Russia, and faster EU membership talks. Tensions remain over frozen Russian assets and energy policy. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz said he expects a decision within 3 weeks on using Russian assets for Ukraine. Meanwhile, Ukraine has dramatically increased the number of attacks on Russian oil refineries in recent months, causing fuel shortages and price raises in parts of Russia. In response, Russia launched missiles and drone strikes on Friday, targeting Ukraine's energy grid, causing critical damage. Naftogaz CEO reported that 35 missiles and 60 drones hit gas and oil facilities in the Kharkiv and Poltava regions overnight. On the battlefield, Ukrainian forces reported tactical gains in Donetsk region, slowing Russian advances despite heavy assaults and daily bombardment of the frontline town of Konstantinivka. We'll be discussing all of this and more with our guests coming right up, but before that, let's take a look at our latest report to find out more. Russian forces carried out massive strikes with missiles and drones on Ukraine's energy infrastructure, including facilities of the gas transportation system, the Energy Ministry of Ukraine reported. Ukraine's Naftogaz CEO says,
"The Russians have once again attacked our gas production facilities in the Kharkiv and Poltava regions. It was a combined strike involving 35 missiles, including a significant number of ballistic ones and 60 drones. Some were shot down, but unfortunately not all. This is the largest massive attack on our gas production infrastructure since the start of the full-scale war."
Russia unleashed one of its most intense aerial assaults over the war on September 28 to 29, launching nearly 600 drones and over 40 missiles across 7 Ukrainian regions. Ukrainian Air Force reported intercepting more than 80% of the drones and more than 60% of the missiles, but the sheer volume strained defenses. In retaliation, Ukrainian forces struck deep into Russia, destroying key energy infrastructure. On Friday, a Ukrainian drone hit a Russian oil refinery on the city of Orsk, near the border with Kazakhstan. The refinery is located approximately 1,400 kilometers from Ukrainian-controlled territory. On September 29th, Security Service of Ukraine drones hit the Tinkovatovo oil pumping station in Chuvashia, over 100 kilometers from the border, halting oil flows and igniting fires. Ukraine's new strategy of targeting oil refineries has hit Russia's economy hard, putting nearly 40% of its oil refining capacity out of operation. Ukraine reports a tactical breakthrough in the Donetsk region, surrounding isolated Russian units near the small town of Dobopilya and inflicting over 3,000 casualties since mid-August. Ukraine's commander-in-chief Alexander Syrsky says Ukrainian elite brigades with Western supply munitions have stalled Moscow's summer push. Russian advances were limited to 146 square kilometers in September, a 34% drop from August. The Pokrovsk area of Donetsk remains the most active battlefield, with Ukrainian forces repelling over 50 Russian assaults daily. Russian forces, however, slowly but steadily continue to capture more ground in many areas, and the situation remains very dire. The 7th meeting of the European Political Community wrapped up in Copenhagen, with leaders once again pledging unwavering support for Ukraine and the security of the continent. No concrete decisions, however, have been made. Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen hosted the talks, open with a stark warning.
Russia will not stop until they are forced to do so. And they are a threat, not only to Ukraine, but to all of us.
She was joined by European Council President Antonio Costa and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, who called for more military aid, tougher sanctions on Russia, and faster EU accession talks for Ukraine and Moldova.
The recent drone incidents across Europe are a clear sign that Russia still feels bold enough to escalate this war. And it was never just about Ukraine. Russia has always aimed to break the West and Europe in particular.
Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban once again stood firm in his opposition to using frozen Russian assets for Ukraine's reconstruction. He also pushed back on Ukraine's EU membership bid, insisting on Hungary's right to decide its own energy policy. Despite the tensions, leaders from across Europe, including the UK, France, Poland, and Germany, echoed a common theme: defending Ukraine is defending Europe. And now joining us to shed more light on the issue is Volodymyr Dubovyk, Director of the Center for International Studies from the Odesa Mechnikov National University. Welcome and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
So there's a lot to unpack in Ukraine this week, and I would like to kick things off with the Warsaw Security Forum. Now, it's an event that gathers some of the highest profile politicians around the world to discuss defense, and of course, Ukraine is on the forefront of these discussions. And my question for you is whether or not this have anything substantial came out of it, and what do you think? Do you think that it pushed the needle forward, or what's your general take from the Security Forum from a Ukrainian perspective?
Right, I had a privilege of attending the forum, which is always a very interesting place to witness some conversations. Behind the scenes, so to speak, small talks, in the lobby, but also from the people on the podium, also some interesting presentations, some interesting ideas. And you're right, much of it was about Ukraine, but also at the same time it was really connected to the rest of European security. So especially with the recent intensification of Russian hybrid attacks against Poland with drones flying in, against Estonia with 3 airplanes going through their airspace, and many other events since. And they basically don't stop, because you hear now about Denmark, and then about French, and then about Oslo, and then about Munich last night when the drones prevented Munich airport from functioning. So it's growing, and people are trying to make sense out of it. People trying to marry it somehow to how we can support Ukraine on the one hand, and how we can actually support ourselves and better prepare ourselves right now, the faster the better, to deal with these hybrid attacks. And I think someone probably dropped the ball here on this side of NATO border, because it was clear that maybe the preparations for the full-scale Russian attack, the kinetic major blow against a NATO country from Russia, wasn't that necessary, because Russia was probably not going to do it. But with the hybrid attacks, with drones, with violating airspace and everything, Russia was always capable of doing that. And why there was no more of a protocol in place and understanding of how we're gonna deal with this. And now, of course, there is a sense of urgency, hence the meeting in Copenhagen. That we probably talk about as well, but here at the Warsaw Security Forum there was very interesting ideas about how to continue help Ukraine, who hasn't lost the war, and Russia by far hasn't won it so far. It's very fluid there still. If you actually send more assistance to Ukraine and provide more pressure on Russia, you can still change the course and the pace of this war in favor of Ukraine, or at least you can help Ukraine to get to the better negotiation position, when at some point Putin and his people would probably sit down for real negotiations. It is important for Ukraine to have a stronger cards to play. And on the other hand, how it is connected to the security of the eastern flank of NATO, entire NATO. Can you actually do both? Can you speed up the production of weapons? Can you actually do more military procurement right now? Not just thinking about what's going to be happening in 5 to 10 years from now. Not only patting each other on the back, how we have agreed at the recent meeting in The Hague, NATO summit, that we're going to spend about 5% on defense. 3.5 on weapons and 1.5 on infrastructure. That is a very nice achievement, but that's so far a commitment. Right. So you need to actually spend this money and spend them fast.
You mentioned something I find quite interesting, because a lot of these meetings previously discussion usually revolve around Ukraine, how to support Ukraine, what kind of weapon system it needs. But this new element of these drone incursion and Russia's hybrid attack on other European nations and other NATO allies, I think adds another different dynamic into the mix, and it's really hard to see these things in isolation any longer. During the WSF, do you see any attempt at trying to juggle this balance between the support for Ukraine, their own kind of domestic needs, and also kind of merging the two in a sense that understanding, supporting and helping Ukraine defend itself against Russia is also in a way defending the NATO's eastern border as well?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that what Russia is doing with drones and everything in Europe now has many functions and many factors shaping it up. First of all, they really want to punish Europe for being belligerent, because right now in Kremlin they think that Trump is willing to accommodate Russia maybe, but Europe is being firmly on Ukraine's side. So Europe is actually talking about supporting Ukraine more and more. There is new intensification of a discussion about using the Russian frozen assets to help Ukraine. So I think Russia wants to punish Europe and basically sending signal, don't do that. Stop with supporting Ukraine, don't cross certain red lines. Second thing is what they're doing is they're saying, all right, you are weak and we're strong. You're not prepared. You say that we are a paper tiger, which was probably not necessarily called for expression from President Trump the other day. To call Russia the paper tiger, I mean, some people would probably applaud it, but others, with their feet on the ground, so to speak, understand that Russia is still strong militarily definitely for Ukraine, definitely for Europe. So if Putin wants to prove that he's not a paper tiger, he's doing exactly that. He's sending drones, he's doing other things, he's messing with ports of Szczecin and Świnoujście here. Prime Minister Tusk talked about it today, I think, in Copenhagen, or was it yesterday? And he's messing with the Euro petrol platforms that Poland controls. And of course, there are ships nearby the major cables on the bottom of the Baltic Sea. So they have ways to actually deliver their blows and make your life hard, right. And show to you that NATO maybe is not that ready. Because of course, 4 drones were downed out of 19 that flew over Poland. Is that a good number? I don't know. Apparently other out of 19 that were not downed did not really represent a danger, to Polish citizens and infrastructure on the ground. But considering how many airplanes were involved, how much money was spent on munition to down those drones, there is indeed many things that I think Poland and other countries can learn from Ukraine, which is dealing with this massive attacks on a daily basis. You don't have to spend this very expensive missiles to down a drone, especially a drone like in that case was actually without explosion on it. So you can actually do it faster. And that's how Ukraine becoming a drone superpower, I think, offering its effort. So not only you can help Ukraine to defend itself, but also Ukraine can help you to defend yourself from the attacks. That's a new power that Ukraine has, and Zelensky talks about it. He talked about it at his presentation at the United Nations General Assembly actually as well. So I think that Putin is really trying to tell to Putin, to the West, like, stand back. Stop your support of Ukraine. It's useless. I mean, we're going to win anyway. There's nothing you're going to change. And with some people, they're agitated, they're angry about what Putin is doing, so they want to fight back. But there are many people in the West at the same time who say, well, probably he's right. So maybe it's time to get some kind of deal with Putin and normalize relations and stop supporting Ukraine and instead push Ukraine to accepting some kind of demands that Russia is imposing on Ukraine. I think that's part of the mission. And finally, also when you send Russian drones into Poland, for instance, what you're doing is that everyone else in the NATO is trying to push and reinforce Poland instead of maybe pushing and reinforcing Ukraine, like you said. And that's the final thing. Sometimes the Western European countries are going to think, should I send the air defense system to Poland now or Estonia, or should I actually send it to Ukraine? And that's what Russia is also doing. They want to make NATO and the EU make these hard choices and maybe be divided within themselves.
I think the word division is very key here. And a lot of times we think about this division and we're just thinking about internally, maybe the squabble, the debates, the decision making, but there's also a diversion of the attention of how much resources can it be dedicated. So even the bureaucracy in these conversations will essentially bog down Ukraine in one way or another. Now, another thing I'm quite curious about is, the supplying of the Tomahawk missiles, because it's been talked about kind of extensively, and there seems to be a little bit of back and forth. I remember President Zelensky first somewhat mentioned it around the time of the UN General Assembly, but then later on there's clarification from Kellogg that these are pretty much merely rumors. Where did the disconnect when it comes to this information come from, and how substantial is this missile actually going to be for Ukraine?
Yeah, well, so that's a good question. I mean, on Ukrainian side, if you're Ukraine, you're basically asking Americans and others, like, what do you have? What can you give us that would meaningfully help us to fight the war? You know, and you decide. I mean, and you give us a list. So we might, if we are Ukraine, we give the list of what we need, and then take a look. They take a look and they say, okay, here we have something, here we don't, here we can do it quickly or something. I think the matter of time, you know, and how quickly you can do it is also something which should be taken into account, because it may be some great weapon, but could be available like in 2 years from now. So that would be too late. You know, so you have something stockpiled in US, which is not being used, and it has enough of it in the US, so the numbers are big in their storages, and they can give it to Ukraine quickly. That should be the focus. So there are many other missiles. You know, the recent decision to give us Aram missiles, you know, was important. The entire Puro formula, the structure, the mechanism where Americans are selling weapons, Europeans are buying the weapons and giving it to Ukraine, it's a great formula. I think it works well for everyone. Actually, Europeans don't have enough weapons that Americans have. Americans selling it, not spending taxpayers' money. That's exactly what Trump wanted, you know, and Ukraine is receiving the weapons. But there is a matter of urgency, how quickly they can be delivered. So the Tomahawks were probably one of the things on the list. It's not, I don't think that Zelensky came last time to Washington, actually New York, and met Trump and said, we need Tomahawks, you know, that's what we need, you know, end of list, end of conversation. He probably said we need a lot of things, right. You know, and then somehow the whole discussion is now about Tomahawks, and initially, of course, Americans saying we're considering it, including Vice President J.D. Vance said we're considering it. But then others are saying, well, why focus on Tomahawks? You know, sometimes in this big war, they've been focused before on something. Okay, will we get the tanks? Or will we get the F-16s? Or will we get ATACMS missiles? Or will we get more for HIMARS or something? You know, there's always some kind of search for silver bullet. And people are assuming if Ukraine gets it from the West, then immediately the war is over and Ukraine wins and Russia is defeated. This is a long conflict. Right. You know, so Tomahawks and no Tomahawks, I mean, if they can spare some, that's great. But of course, then would also be a matter of how many they can give to us, and we need to train people to use them again, except that Ukrainians are very fast learners, but still there will be need to learn how to use the weapons. So I wouldn't necessarily, you know, make a big deal out of Tomahawks, whether we receive it or not. You know, they should be part of the entire framework. You know, the missiles and other things should be sent to Ukraine so Ukraine can better defend itself and incur losses on Russia, so that one day Putin or someone else in Moscow would sit down and say, okay, maybe it doesn't make sense for us to continue this war.
Right, like you mentioned, I think a lot of us have this kind of tunnel vision when it comes to the name of these weapon systems, equipment, missiles, and then just kind of like a whole new cycle around it. And I think a lot of it does come with the psychology of really wanting Ukraine to win and hoping that this new thing, not essentially new, but new thing on the media cycle is the silver bullet that would put an end to the war. However, there is an argument to be made for the Tomahawk missile due to its range, and people are saying that this would essentially allow these strikes to go deep into Russia. Do you think that that is something that puts it on a radar? Because even President Putin came out and said that essentially that would be a red line. Of course, we've seen that kind of rhetoric before, but do you think there's anything different this time around? Yeah,
so you're absolutely right. There have been all sorts of red lines before, you know, and they're already saying NATO is in war with Russia. So even without the Tomahawks decision. So what difference does it make? Actually, people in the West are learning to live with this constant statements about red lines coming from Kremlin. You know, it was a steep learning curve for them, you know, but they're learning. And over 3.5 years now of this massive war being waged against Ukraine by Russia, you know, and even the current administration in Washington now, they're also learning. You know, initially they were very very cautious in many respects. Now they're not as cautious, and therefore they say, okay, you know, let's give Ukrainians what they need to use. And we now know that actually in the previous conversations over phone, President Trump inquired of Mr. Zelensky, are they willing to strike, say, St. Petersburg, he said Leningrad, old name of the city, or Moscow. And Zelensky said, well, if that is what we need for this war, and if you give us the right weapons, we will. But then what kind of conclusion Trump made out of this answer from Zelensky? Now we're seeing they're talking about Tomahawks, but with Tomahawks, like I said, is also very important. Assume they're given to Ukraine. Then within what time frame? How many? Would that be a steady supply of Tomahawks to Ukraine, or would be a one-time thing? Because all this matters. If we get Tomahawks, great, thank you. But if not too many, we use them and then we don't have them. And the wars could be still a longer process. We're going to keep applying this pressure on the front line on Russia. And because this is asymmetric war, Russia is still a stronger military player than Ukraine is. What we see right now is Ukraine successfully hitting infrastructure in Russia, which is supplying everything that the war effort needs within Ukraine. That's the way to go. Even people who were very skeptical early on initially about the strikes that Ukraine does against Russian infrastructure, they're now very supportive, because they see these numbers, how Russian oil refinery business is shrinking and damaged, and therefore there is a problem with gasoline, with petroleum, including the fuel that Russian troops need in Ukraine to fight the war. So to help Ukraine to deliver those strikes, that's exactly what you need. But whether it's Tomahawks, some other weapons, that's for our allies and our friends and our partners in the West to decide.
Right. Something you brought up very interesting that I do want to expand a little bit more upon is the strike on these oil refinery and these infrastructures. Ever since the beginning of the war, even before that, people have been calling Russia essentially a gas station with an army. And, well, with the energy still being the dominant kind of income for Russia, how substantial do you think that these hits on the Russian refinery is really going to hurt their war coffer? And do you think that, with the front, they might be putting on a good face, but in the back, they're actually sweating a little bit?
Yeah. Well, I think the strikes are working. I mean, let's not exaggerate the impact, but let's not, to play it down as well. First of all, you are hitting the capability, the capacity for Russia to produce more oil and everything. And not only it's domestically consumed, not only it goes for Russian troops in Ukraine, but it's also being sold outside of Russia. So that could be a factor, that they don't have enough oil to sell outside of Russia. And that's exactly the money which they're using to fund the war against Ukraine. So that's one factor. Another factor is that it seems that the government in Kremlin is not really controlling the situation well. They're not defending well. I mean, what is this so prized and so praised air defense, which is allowing Ukrainian drones to fly for hundreds and hundreds miles or kilometers to hit targets deeply within Russia. So I think it's actually increasing pressure on Putin in the eyes of Russians, and to bring the war to the level that the common average rank-and-file Russians would understand was always part of design for us Ukrainians and our allies in the West. Because if you're just sitting comfortably somewhere in Russia and your life hasn't changed for the last 3.5 years, that's a problem. Then you can support the war. But if your life has changed, if you don't have gasoline, if maybe prices are growing up, if you hear booms in the sky over your own city, then you tend to think like maybe it's not going well for us. Maybe it's time to end it. Right. And hence you have sociological polls where you actually see more and more Russians saying we would like to end this war and end it diplomatically. Unfortunately, they still want to end it, according to the Russian understanding how it should end, that Ukraine should basically give up. But I think it's working. I think it's working in so many ways. And if it's asymmetric warfare, that's what it is. What Ukraine can do. If they're hitting our energy infrastructure and they are basically putting us on the verge of not having electricity in the winter and not having anything to keep the heat in our houses in Ukraine, then we need to return it in kind. We need to return pressure. We need to match the pressure. And this strikes allow us to do it, and even without Western weapons, because all of it that we've been using because of some limitations of the Western weapons, how we can use it against targets in Russia, we've been limited always. So that's why Ukraine delivered their own drones. We delivered our own missiles as well when delivering. There is a new one called Flamingo, which has been delivered right now, which could be a game changer if you do it quickly and you produce enough of them quickly. So yeah, I think the strikes are actually making a lot of sense. I'm not saying that the strikes alone would allow Ukraine to win the war. No, but it could be part of a bigger strategy.
Right. Now, you also mentioned, of course, Russia also hitting Ukraine when it comes to energy infrastructure, trying to leave them out in the cold during the winter. And with this little back and forth, we also saw an increasing attempt at hitting Ukrainian energy structure. Do you think that is like a tit-for-tat move, kind of essentially Russia sending a message that, hey, if you hit our energy, we're going to hit yours as well? Right. And if this continues, who do you think wins the energy war down the line?
I think it's the same old tactics. They've been using it for a number of years now, several winters in a row. They basically want Ukraine to put us in a darkness and coldness and everything, and they are looking for the point of break with Ukrainians. For a moment when Ukrainians would say enough is enough, stop this war, give Russia what it wants, maybe going in the street and demanding Mr. Zelensky, our president, just give them the lands that they need, whatever Russia wants, just to stop this suffering that we are going through, except that it's not working. Actually, people in Ukraine are getting angrier and angrier with each strike. So it's not working necessarily. Someone is misreading the psyche of Ukrainians, the mentality of Ukrainians. Because, if you're suddenly in the cold and, your phone is not working, your heating is not working, anything is not working, you don't necessarily are angry with Zelensky, right. Who is trying to prevent you, or your own armed forces, which is trying to down Russian drones or missiles, but you're angry exactly with Russia for doing that. So it wouldn't work, but they're trying, and also sending message to the West. You can't win this war. It's hopeless. Stop helping Ukraine. Talk sense to Ukraine so that they give up. Stop surrendering. Stop resisting and surrendering, and surrender to our demands. That's what Kremlin is trying to do.
And last but not least, if we can turn our attention to the front line, I would like to take your perspective on the recent situation. Putin saying that Russian forces are advancing across the entire front of the Sumy region and taking half of Volchansk as well. This actually does put some more crucial Ukrainian cities under the range of Russian drones. Is there a worry there?
As for drones, Russia can reach or missiles, any part of Ukraine. What it does, it actually provides Russia better range to use artillery. To strike certain cities. But their advances are very minuscule. They're very small, and they're paying a huge price. It's always been the case. They're willing to pay this price, unfortunately, regrettably, in the lives of Russian soldiers. We cannot change their mentality. Putin doesn't care about the lives of Russian soldiers at all. But at the same time, they're not advancing fast enough. Again, if you look at the absolute numbers of how much land Russia has taken since February 2022, that's a very small number. Ukraine still has by far the largest portion of the territory under our control. That's how it's going to be, and there is no scenario under which Russia would suddenly be able to take much more land.
Thank you so much for your input and insight. Really appreciate it. And thanks for helping us out with unpacking all these topics.
You got it. Thank you for having me.
Cheers. And thank you for tuning into this edition of Ukraine This Week. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.